Now, to give the Anglicans and every other Protestant group, by the way, I mean, it was unanimous rejection of transubstantiation at the time of the Reformation on the Protestant side. To give them a little slack here, Thomas's articulation was not the articulation that was common at the time of the Reformation. Shortly after Thomas, other Catholic theologians even explicitly say the Eucharist is an exception to the rule that there. Oh, I can't remember exactly the wording now, but that there always must be signs. And in fact, they start to articulate the accidents not as signs, but as you mentioned near the beginning of the podcast, as disguises. Yeah. And so you get this sense that there's a real change underneath at the level of substance that you would be able to perceive with your senses if you were not sort of preserved from that by these disguising accidents. And there were Catholic theologians who were articulating the Eucharist in this way. And so when Luther and Calvin and the Anglicans and everyone says that can't be right, Thomas Aquinas would say amen. Like, that's not what I said. I agree, Protestants, there does have to be a sign element here. This can't be a disguise. That's not how sacraments work.
Well, hey, everybody. Thank you for joining me again on the Theological Arsonist. I am your host, Jonah Saller, and today I have a really special episode for you. This is actually going to be a crossover episode with my guest's podcast, Thinking Faith, which I'm going to be linking down below. But I have joining me today Dr. Brett Salkeld, who wrote this wonderful book, Transubstantiation, Theology, History, and Christian Unity. And I have to say that this is just an excellent piece of work. I came across it actually watching Gospel Simplicity. He did an interview with you not too long ago, and I was blown away by that interview, just hearing things about transubstantiation that I had never heard before. It really revolutionized my view, and so I was like, I got to get the complete picture and buy the book. So I bought the book, I read it, and I have to say it really brought deep hope to my soul about the future of Christian unity. One of the things that I strive for on this channel is really pursuing ecumenical dialogue and ecumenical unity amongst Catholics, Orthodox, Protestants. And I think this book is a really good step in that direction, because I think one of the main things that potentially separates Protestants from Catholics is over the Eucharist, is over Eucharistic differences. And so I think the closer we can get to an understanding, and maybe even saying, you know what, transubstantiation, that's a view that's compatible with Protestant theology, the closer we're going to be to honoring the very important words of our Savior, who prayed for the oneness of his church. And so, Dr. Salkeld, thank you so much for coming on and joining me today. Before I really get into the topic, would you just briefly be able to give a quick who you are, what you do, so that my audience can get to know you?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks so much for having me, Jonah. And let me just say, this is what an author dreams of, is that, someone hears about his book and reads it and thinks that it will do what the author was trying to do when he wrote it, So I'm deeply committed to growth and mutual understanding amongst Christians. On this topic and many others, I think we're closer than we realize, because there's so many caricatures of one another in our history. And so a real chance to dig into what the other group actually believes is so valuable. So happy to do that again here. I'm the theologian for the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Regina. So I don't work primarily in the academy, though I do teach courses for different colleges, and I direct a satellite program for Newman Theological College, which is in Edmonton. We have a program here for Catholic teachers, a master's in religious ed, that I direct the Saskatchewan cohort. But my main task, my day job, is in the diocesan offices. I direct our diaconate formation program, I have a podcast that we record out of the offices here with our director of communications, who's a graduate of our diaconate program. And I write and speak and consult on a whole range of issues. I'm a theologian who can't live in an ivory tower because I get emails from the people of God almost every day with very specific, practical, on the ground kinds of questions, or from the bishop or priests or other people doing pastoral work. So it's a neat place to work. And I wonder if, well, this is maybe going too far off, but I wonder if there's going to be more of that in the future. If the academy, maybe it was a little odd for theology to be quite so strictly contained within the academy. And I wonder if theologians working in more pastoral contexts, I know, in your own tradition in Anglicanism, there's more of a tradition of the theologian pastor, maybe than there has been in Catholicism. Now, I'm not a pastor, I'm a lay person, but anyways, that's a whole other story. I live in Regina, beautiful Regina, with my wife Flannery and our 7 children. So that's what keeps me busy a lot of the time. And if I can do a little plug, I'm writing another book, this one for Catholic teachers, tentatively titled Educating for Eternity, something guide to making every class Catholic. So that's a current project. I'm almost done it. It'll be out probably this time next year.
Awesome. Well, I look forward to reading that as well. And go ahead and please plug, you wrote a book prior to Transubstantiation that I have not read yet, but is also in the realm of ecumenical discussion.
Yeah, I wrote a little book on purgatory. The title is way too long. It's called Can Catholics and Evangelicals Agree About Purgatory and the Last Judgment? But it's a very accurately descriptive title. This is exactly what the book is about. Yeah, check that out if you're interested in the question of purgatory. If you read it and you want to talk about it, I'd be happy to come back on your show.
Sure. Yeah, cool. I'll have the links below to both of those books, and I'm definitely going to read it and hopefully have another discussion, because that's a subject that does interest me a lot. I've actually done a bit of writing on that. Cool. Well, to get into this subject, maybe I'll just start by asking you why write this book? Why is transubstantiation? Why write on it?
Right. Yeah. So it was actually, the Purgatory book was my master's thesis, and I was looking for something analogous for a doctoral dissertation. I wanted to find a central sort of question between Catholics and Protestants where I thought that, our understanding of what the other group believed was probably not all that accurate, and that some careful historical and theological work could get us closer to understanding one another. So as I was doing my coursework and my doctorate, I was watching out for a topic, and I ended up doing a course on ecumenical dialogue with my mentor, Margaret O'Gara. The book is dedicated to her. She passed away. I sent her the 3rd chapter on Luther, but I don't think she ever got to read it. She did read the 2nd chapter. So I was working with Margaret, and I wrote a paper for her class on Eucharistic presence in ecumenical dialogue and transubstantiation in particular. And both of us independently went back and sat with it. And then when we had a meeting, we both said, I was thinking that's the topic.
Oh, wow.
So it really came together because, and the reason why is that I personally made a breakthrough on that paper. I had a misunderstanding of transubstantiation. And so when I discovered my own misunderstanding, then it became much clearer to me how Catholics sometimes misrepresent themselves on this point, and how Protestants misunderstand Catholics, partly because Catholics misrepresent themselves.
Sure.
And there's a whole bunch of other factors, historical and everything else. But it was a kind of personal breakthrough that I realized that I wasn't doing a good job of explaining this. And I was ending up in awkward sort of having to make ad hoc rationalizations for sort of pointed questions that Protestants would make. And when I had the breakthrough, it was like, no, that's all besides the point. That's not even what this is about. And the major thing was imagining transubstantiation as like a quasi-physical or clandestine chemical sort of transformation instead of a way of articulating the church's constant tradition of belief that something real is happening here at a deeper level than the physical, right?
Right.
And once that clicked, I was like, well, Protestants seem mostly opposed to this like overly physical idea. There's other concerns. I mean, that's just the biggest surface one. There's other concerns that we get into, but for me, that was the breakthrough. And then I started reading, and I loved it. It was great to study this, and there was so much. And as I was reading, I was like, this is so clarifying. This is so clarifying. This is so helpful. And then I started reading Protestants, and I'll stop in just a second, but I'll finish with this story. When I first started reading Thomas, I made some comments on my social media about how Catholics are misunderstanding their own teaching. And some people accused me of being a Calvinist. And I said, no, it's straight from Thomas. Like, just go read the Summa,
Yeah.
By no means am I a Calvinist, I said. I hadn't read Calvin yet, not in any depth,
Yeah.
So then when I got to my 4th chapter and I start reading Calvin, well, lo and behold, I'm not the first person to recognize this. Calvin and Thomas are way closer than anyone who hasn't read them would guess.
Yeah.
And even the Lutherans who don't like Calvin and Thomas say we're too much alike in a negative sense, that Thomas was a proto-Calvinist or something like that. But so I just found so much more room for understanding than we've all been given to believe is possible.
Yeah, and I have to agree with you. As I was reading your book, specifically in the chapter about Calvin, I was struck at how much continuity there was. I was just like, because I've read Calvin before, and more recently I've become quite fond of Thomas Aquinas. He's absolutely, what an intellect. But the more that I read them both, the more I can see that, there are actually a lot of similarities. So it's a really beautiful thing. Well, perhaps maybe the best thing to do now is just defining some of these terms that can often be confusing. So maybe if you could sketch out what is transubstantiation in its most basic form, and then we can kind of go deeper into substance and accidents. And I think those will especially be helpful to clarify, because I know for myself personally, substance, physical, that's how I equated it, right? The substance changing into the body and blood of Christ. That means that Christ is physically there. And now we have these accidents, which just means it's this disguise to keep our eyes from beholding this carnal flesh and blood. And that's always how I approached it. And I think a lot of Protestants, maybe even a lot of my listeners viewing this, that's the image they have in their head of what transubstantiation is declaring. So if you wouldn't mind just kind of clarifying that.
Sure. Yeah, I'll give the basic definition, and then maybe I'll try to give a little historical context, because that will help us understand the definitions too. So really basic definition, transubstantiation means the change of substance. In this case, well, this is the only case of it. It never happens anywhere else, but the change of the substance of the bread into the substance of the body of Christ, and the substance of the wine into the substance of the blood of Christ. Now, you got to figure out why did the church in the late 12th and into the 13th century decide that this was a useful way to talk about what was going on in the Eucharist? And basically there's a controversy where the Eucharistic coherence of the early church is starting to break down, because now people are in a philosophical context where symbol and real are kind of incompatible or mutually exclusive. And so the question becomes, is Christ really present or symbolically present? And in the early church, that was a false dichotomy. If you asked a Platonist, which is what most of the fathers of the church were philosophically, is this symbolic or real? They just say, well, yes.
Sure,
But once that starts to break down, then you need new language to be able to articulate what's going on. And what happens is there's an early kind of scuffle, and Berengarius of Tours, who's the first one to make a really clear argument saying it can't be real, it has to be understood symbolically. He gets dragged to Rome, and he's forced to swear an oath. And the oath describes the presence of Christ in the Eucharist with this adjective sensualiter, which is really unfortunate, because literally what it means is in the realm of the five senses, which of course you and I, if you've ever been to Eucharist, you know that's not actually the case, right?
Right.
And so then you end up with this awkward sense, as you described, that, well, it must be sort of hidden from our senses. So it's some sort of clandestine presence. Well, Berengarius goes back home. He recants the oath he swore, says it was under duress. That's almost certainly true, by the way. And he keeps up the theological battle. And then the other theologians catch up with him. And they start to come up with better articulations. 20 years later, Berengarius is back in Rome and he has to swear a new oath, this one much more theologically competent. And there's a new adjective, and it's substantialiter, so substantially in English. And it's this adverb in this oath, second oath of Berengarius, that plants the seed for what becomes transubstantiation. Now, why did they choose substance? Aristotle's being rediscovered at this time, and has a lot of influence in the universities and that sort of thing. And although substance is not unknown to Catholic or Christian theology, I mean, it's in the creed, right, of one substance, consubstantial. So already in the creed, it's this sense of the deepest reality of a thing, right? When we say Jesus is consubstantial with the Father, we don't mean shares all the physical molecules, right? Because the Father's not made of molecules, right? So that can't be what it means. It's a way of discussing the deepest reality. But if we want to get really technical in the Aristotelian categories that are being used at the time, substance is that which is present to the intellect. So all kinds of things are present to our senses, and those are accidents. And we use adjectives to describe them. So let's imagine some sugar, right? Well, it's sweet. I can tell that with my senses. But sweet is an adjective. It's white. I can perceive that with my senses, and that's an accident, but that's also an adjective. It's granular. I can perceive that by touch or by sight, but that's an adjective, and that's an accident. I can never actually see, taste, touch, smell sugar without interfacing with these accidents. I never attain to the thing itself by my physical senses. It's only my intellect that says, look, this granular, white, sweet thing, which all my senses can give me all that data, but it's my intellect that says that's sugar. And we do this with everything. We encounter them through our senses, but then our intellect is actually able to say, this is the thing that I'm encountering. Our intellect can apprehend an intelligibility that is deeper than the physical elements. And we know this, by the way, because when physical elements change, our intellect knows how to deal with that. I just met you here, but if we encountered one another again and you had shaved your beard, my intellect is not like, it is another thing. I cannot, right? No, I can see that there's an accidental change that doesn't alter who or what you are. We can see this. Two really good examples I like to use. One is the human person. I can identify you as the same being that was a one-celled creature at one point. Now that cell probably never made it out of your mother's womb, right? It was probably gone, sloughed off at some point in your development before you were even born. But I can still identify you with that, and I can identify you on your deathbed, even if all your cells have changed, because there's something intelligible that I can apprehend. Another good example is a river. There's this famous line in Greek philosophy, you can never step in the same river twice, because this idea that rivers are constantly in flux, which is true. But somehow you and I can go down to the river today and go down to the river tomorrow, even though it is altered slightly, and identify it as the same river.
Right.
And in fact, we can do that over the course of like hundreds of thousands or millions of years. We could identify a river despite dramatic changes in its physical composition, right? So, but our intelligence can apprehend something that underlies the physical and gives it a kind of intelligible unity. That's substance. And so, of course, then accidents are all these other things. Substance, and if you want to be really simple, substance is nouns, right?
Sure.
Sugar,
Okay.
that's a noun.
Right.
And accidents are adjectives: sweet, white, granular. And we do this all the time. I mean, Aristotle gave certain language to it, but it's actually, in a way, it's common sense. Like, we know the difference between nouns and adjectives in our everyday experience and how we talk. So the tradition said this actually allows us to say that whatever's going on in the Eucharist is real, very, very real. God is doing something on the one hand, and on the other hand, we don't need to smuggle in some sense that there's some clandestine chemical change, or that the only kind of real, and this is the danger for modern people, the only kind of real is that you can find with a microscope or a mass spectrometer, right?
Right.
And we want to say, like, no, there's reality that's deeper than that. If you believe in the Christian doctrine of creation, you don't think the material is the most real thing.
Right. Yeah. Wow. That's excellent. This actually leads into a good quote from your book that really stood out to me in relationship to that idea that substance is this deepest reality, but it doesn't mean what we're not talking about is this annihilation of bread and wine replaced with this physical thing. And it's on page 50, but you said, according to Thomas, the sacrament does not contain any deception. Our senses perceive the signs of bread and wine, and those signs really are there. The bread and the wine are essential to the sacrament precisely as signs. In fact, the continued presence of the bread and wine, as in consubstantiation, would obscure the signification proper to the sacrament, because the sacramental signs would no longer lead only to the heavenly, but to the earthly as well, not Christ's body and blood, as is proper to the sacrament, but to bread and wine. So basically, from what I'm understanding as I was reading this, is that contrary to really my articles, which say that transubstantiation overthroweth the nature of a sacrament, Thomas Aquinas, as he's articulating this, is actually preserving the nature of a sacrament with sign and signified by having the substance of bread and wine change to the substance of the body and blood of Christ. It actually allows the accidents to become pure signs. Is that correct?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And Thomas is very careful on this, because his own definition of sacrament, several questions earlier before he gets to the Eucharist, he starts with, sacraments in general. I mean, his own definition of sacrament is like, God needs to approach us through medium that we can apprehend, and we are physical, temporal beings. We need signs. So for Thomas, sign is part of the definition of what makes a sacrament. So he would agree with the 39 articles, the Anglican 39 articles, that a sacrament needs signs to be properly a sacrament. And if you didn't have them, it would in fact overthrow the nature of the sacrament. Now, to give the Anglicans and every other Protestant group, by the way, I mean, it was unanimous rejection of transubstantiation at the time of the Reformation on the Protestant side. To give them a little slack here, Thomas's articulation was not the articulation that was common at the time of the Reformation. Shortly after Thomas, other Catholic theologians even explicitly say the Eucharist is an exception to the rule that there. Oh, I can't remember exactly the wording now, but that there always must be signs. And in fact, they start to articulate the accidents not as signs, but as you mentioned near the beginning of the podcast, as disguises. Yeah. And so you get this sense that there's a real change underneath at the level of substance that you would be able to perceive with your senses if you were not sort of preserved from that by these disguising accidents. And there were Catholic theologians who were articulating the Eucharist in this way. And so when Luther and Calvin and the Anglicans and everyone says that can't be right, Thomas Aquinas would say amen. Like, that's not what I said. I agree, Protestants, there does have to be a sign element here. This can't be a disguise. That's not how sacraments work.
Right. Wow. Yeah, that's good. So would you say then that broadly it was this annihilationistic type view of the Eucharist that was being attacked by the reformers rather than Thomas Aquinas's articulation.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. So if we go back in time a little bit, when transubstantiation is first sort of getting off the ground, there's a few options. It's not immediately clear. This is before Thomas. Before Thomas, it means that there's a change, but how that change is articulated is kind of open-ended. And the three options are consubstantiation. So people think Luther came up with that. Luther didn't come up with that. That's 300 years before Luther. That was an option.
Lutherans will lose their mind if you tell them that they hold to consubstantiation.
Right. Yeah. So that's not Luther's idea. Consubstantiation is one, which means that the substance of the body and blood come to join with, meaning with, the substance of the bread and wine. One is what we come to know as transubstantiation with Thomas, which is it's precisely the substance of the bread that becomes the substance of Christ's body, and same thing for the wine and Christ's blood. And the third option is an annihilation and replacement theory. So rather than the substance of the bread becoming the substance of Christ's body, the substance of the bread is annihilated and then replaced. Now, Thomas rejects both the consubstantiation and the replacement annihilation possibilities as incoherent. And I go into, some detail on that in my book about why he does that. But then he opts for what becomes the classical Catholic view, that it's precisely the substance of the bread that becomes the body of Christ. Now, there's larger theological implications here, right? What does God do with creation? Does he destroy it and replace it? Or does he transform it from within? I mean, this is not accidental that Thomas would prefer this, because it's how God works with a broken creation generally, right? And I go into some of those details in the book. But to go to your original question, the annihilation replacement theory, which Thomas rejects, actually comes to be dominant by the time of the Reformation as well. And you will still on occasion hear Catholics say things like the bread and the wine are destroyed or annihilated or any, something like that. Sure. And what they're trying to do, they're trying to just really emphasize that it's really, really, really Jesus. Well, okay, we can grant good intentions there, but that kind of sloppy language that doesn't accurately represent Catholic teaching puts an unnecessary stumbling block for Protestants and is actually not very theologically or philosophically coherent, So, yeah, that annihilation replacement theory, it sneaks up, but it's not what Thomas wanted to say at all.
Yeah. So I'm going to just try to put into words how one could talk about transubstantiation, just for clarity's sake, and you can tell me how I do.
Okay.
But basically,
oral exam.
Yeah, oral exam. So the substance of the bread and wine becomes the substance of the body and blood of Christ. But the accidents remain, and the accidents are truly, actually, physically there. But the reason that one would not reference them as bread and wine is because at the deepest level, at the substance level, they are actually the body and blood of Christ. Is that?
You got it.
Good. Okay. That's just so helpful, because I can't tell you how long I believed that what was physically changing was the physical elements were becoming the physical body and blood of Christ under this disguise. And so to have that idea that this is not, we're not talking about a carnal physical presence. We're talking about the physical, what you see, what you taste, what you touch, what you smell. It is actually really, truly there. But what it is at the deepest level, substance, it is the body and blood of Christ.
Right. And let me just add, so the language of physically, and there's a few other adjectives that we use sometimes. Physically, sometimes we say literally, actually. There was a survey that asked Catholics if they thought Christ was actually present. Well, all of those words, it depends what you mean by them, but they're not the words Thomas used. They're not the words in the Catechism. They're not the words of the tradition, and they're theologically ambiguous. So if you say Christ is physically present, you might mean something perfectly orthodox.
Sure.
But because you're just trying to say real, but you're giving a false impression maybe to yourself, but certainly to other people about the implications. And so then you get Catholics, you hear these news stories, some atheist kidnapped a host at Mass and took it into the lab and then triumphantly announces, they looked in a microscope and it's just bread. And now if you know what transubstantiation means, you should say, of course, right. That's what you'd find with a microscope. But what you end up is Catholics saying things like, oh, Jesus could miraculously remove himself to avoid the sacrilege of being subjected to scientific, inquiry or something. Well, of course he could. Right. but that's just never what we meant, So if you end up having to give those kinds of explanations, something's gone wrong further back. And this is some of the mistakes I made, when I was younger, before I had this breakthrough that I talked about at the beginning in the paper I wrote for Margaret O'Gara. Protestants would say, well, wouldn't Christ have run out of body if we've been eating him for 2,000 years? And of course, a Catholic, well, it's the answer is really easy. Christ could always make more, couldn't he? I mean, you can appeal to God's, omnipotence anytime you want to fill in those gaps. But the point is, I never needed an answer like that, because that's not how it works. That's right. Not how sacraments function, right? It's not Jesus replenishing a body that's running out of molecules, Right. He's being effectively symbolized for us, which is why we can say, by the way, we don't eat part of Jesus. I'm not getting, a toenail today and some lung tissue next week or right. Whatever, right? I get what the tradition says, whole in the whole and whole in every part. Yeah. Because every piece of bread that is large enough to be recognizable to our senses as bread is large enough to signify what the Eucharist signifies, which right. is the body and blood of Christ. Now, that doesn't mean it's only a symbol, but it does mean it works on the logic of symbol, because that's what sacraments do. Right.
That makes a lot of sense. So I have to ask just a question that popped into my head that I don't have in my notes, but you're talking about if somebody puts a host under a microscope, right? It's not surprising that they're not finding, flesh and blood. So how would you respond to like some of the Eucharistic miracles that are reported where like a host is bleeding or something? How does somebody who holds to transubstantiation deal with those that have more of a physical dimension to them?
Right. Well, yeah, there's a few responses, and Thomas himself does deal with this. But before I get to Thomas's answer, the first thing is to say, those miracles may or may not have happened in this or that claim, right? I won't say they never happen. I also won't say that every single time someone has claimed it, it's actually happened. I'm happy to reserve, reserve judgment on the particular claims. But I will say, I think the evidence is pretty strong in church history that this seems to happen at least sometimes. Sure. Now, the question is, if that's transubstantiation, then 99.9999999 repeating of the Eucharists ever consecrated in the history of the world didn't work.
Sure. No.
Right. So it can't be what transubstantiation means. It can only be an exceptional case granted for God's own purposes, maybe to increase faith, in this person or community or whatever. Right. So, and Thomas, that gets us towards Thomas's answer. He says, something about, God being able to grant this in particular cases. But he also says, which is really interesting, he says, sometimes these miracles happen in the physical elements themselves, and sometimes they just happen in your eyes. Which I think is actually, right. Historically, that you could probably make a lot of sense out of different claims with Thomas's hermeneutic of sometimes it happens in the bread and sometimes it happens in your eyes.
In your eyes. I like that. That's a good answer. Cool. Well, maybe moving on. So I was struck by the idea that if you don't have the substance of bread and wine becoming the substance of the body and blood of Christ, and you keep more of a consubstantiation type view, the sign signified gets distorted ultimately. You're what is the sign? What is the signified? Where am I looking? What is what? And so I kind of want to start moving into just talking a little bit about the reformers, and maybe talking about, we'll start with Luther and then go to Calvin. But specifically with Luther, it seems like that was one of the issues within, specifically later. And it's interesting, you talk about this in your book, but Aquinas, really, transubstantiation came about as a response to faulty views of the Eucharist that were trying to reduce it to a mere symbol. And in the case of Luther, he's rejecting transubstantiation. We don't need to complicate this. It is the body and blood of Christ. End of story. Then Zwingli comes along, and Luther resorts to philosophy to try to express how real presence works. So it's just ironic in there to see that progression in his thought. But maybe would you just be able to kind of note where the continuity is found in Luther and Aquinas, but also where there's a stark difference?
Right. Yeah. I mean, so Luther, I mean, parallels the whole tradition in that at first he just is happy with the sort of plain affirmation of the words of Scripture, but once the question is raised, it won't go away. Right. Once someone says, look, the plain reading of Scripture won't work, it's incoherent, this must be only a symbol, just look at it. The tradition goes through that with Berengarius, but then Luther goes through that himself personally. He says, none of this, we don't need all this philosophy, it's just obscuring the plain word of God. And then the Zwinglian challenge comes, and he has to make some claim that says what I'm saying isn't just nonsense, it's not just incoherent. Right. But he's already discounted transubstantiation as a reasonable option here, and so then he has to kind of start from scratch and do the work on his own. Not exactly from scratch, because he does have the nominalist tradition, and it's interesting, by the time of Luther, the nominalist tradition has said, and this is a really weird move, actually, Thomas would roll over in his grave. The nominalist tradition says consubstantiation is more coherent than transubstantiation. And maybe I'll visit in a second why they thought that. But then they said, but since the church has defined transubstantiation, we accept it on the authority of the church, even though consubstantiation would make more sense philosophically. Well, then you get to Luther, he's already rejected the authority of the church for other reasons. So he doesn't typically call it consubstantiation because he doesn't want Aristotle and all this, but he is an heir to that tradition that says it requires fewer superfluous miracles to leave the bread and wine alone and just add the body and blood of Christ than to do this annihilation replacement. But of course, Thomas had said no to that option as well, right? So by the time of Luther, there's a kind of false choice between the annihilation replacement on the one hand and the consubstantiation on the other, and transubstantiation has kind of disappeared. So now, why did the nominalists think this? Well, partly because substance had shifted from being this thing that's present to the intellect to one more accident. It was the precursor of our modern use of the word substance to mean physical thing had already started. And in that case, it's harder to say the substance and the bread and wine have changed if you don't see any change. So of course they're still there, just look at it, because the word doesn't mean what it meant anymore. So you have this whole change in the philosophical language, which leads to a different conclusion about which option is more coherent. And Luther is an heir to that tradition. So when Zwingli pushes back against his claim of real presence, Luther is able to rely on some of these nominalist categories. Now, what I argue in the book is he's sort of valiantly, he makes a valiant effort here, but at a few points, I think Luther kind of swings and misses. And one of them is on signs and signification. I think consubstantiation ends up garbling the signs and the signified to some degree. Maybe that's the biggest one. No, the other one is Luther, when pressed. And here's the thing about Luther. You have to be generous when you read him, because he's going to write in a polemic kind of voice. Right. And he'll say very strong things. But then if you challenge him and say, well, you can't mean that, he says, don't be an idiot. Of course I don't mean that. Right. Right. So you have to be aware of how Luther writes to not overinterpret him. But of course, the trick is he ends up saying things that are almost overly physical.
Right.
His version ends up losing, and this is partly related to him losing the connection between sign and signified. It becomes less of a sacramental logic in the background and more of a sort of brute presence that's Jesus said it's here, so here it is. That leads him into difficulties that lead other Protestants to say, well, that can't be right.
Right.
That's worse than the Catholics. Goodness sake, Luther, what are you doing?
Right.
So for the very concrete example, the first oath of Berengarius, where he swore the sensualiter, almost every theologian in the history of the church, there's very rare examples of theologians who think that was a good oath. They think the second oath of Berengarius is much more theologically coherent, the one that led to transubstantiation. Luther's one of the only people in the history of the church who says, give me that first oath.
Wow.
He says, if only all popes had acted so wonderfully as this pope acted when he made Berengarius swear this, very carnal oath. It was about crunching with the teeth and all this kind of stuff, right?
Yeah.
So Luther, I think Luther goes off the rails a bit there. And then the problem is it generates pushback from other Protestants, not from Catholics largely. It becomes an intra-Protestant debate where Luther becomes sort of Berengarius's sort of blunt, carnal opponents, and Zwingli and his followers become Berengarius, 400 years after the fact.
Yeah, that's very, very interesting. I do have kind of a clarifying question that I stumbled across this quote in your book on page 237. It's in the section talking about Calvin, but with this idea that Luther, his view ultimately kind of garbled the sign and signified distinction. You're talking about the reception, how one receives Christ, which I really want to go into with Calvin, but you speak about how Thomas Aquinas, he can distinguish between what's received objectively and subjectively, because for him, Christ's body and blood were both sign and thing. As sign, it is received objectively, sacramentally, regardless of the faith of the recipient. As thing, however, it's only accessible to the one who has first read and believed the sign. So with that, if the sign is in some sense Christ, then how does that not also confuse sign signified?
Right.
You see the question?
Okay, yeah. So this is a complex piece, and I hope I get it right. I mean, I will encourage people who are interested to read the book, because I had to do careful work for a long time on this. But here's
I apologize if that's way too big a question for this scope, but
it's a very fair question. But I will warn the listener that if what I get to in the next few minutes here is not fully satisfactory, check out the book, because there's even, I would say already, what we said about Luther scrambling the signs. If you want to look into that, read the relevant section of the book, because it does take careful parsing to see what's going on there. But here's the basic framework. In the medieval period, Thomas and others developed this tripartite schema for all the sacraments, not just the Eucharist, where there's the sign on the one hand, the sign and the thing is the sort of second layer of signification, and the third thing is this thing itself. This is very complicated stuff, but in the Eucharist, the sign is sacramentum tantum. The sign itself is the physical accident to the bread and wine.
Right.
The thing, the res tantum, is the unity of the church. So the end goal of the Eucharist isn't just to have Jesus present, but that in itself has a further goal and is itself a sign towards that further goal. So in the middle, you have this intermediate term, which is the presence of Christ in the sacrament, which is, on the one hand, it's what is signified by the bread and wine, and on the other hand, it signifies the end goal of the sacrament, the res tantum. And so it's this, if the body of Christ is both a thing that is signified and itself something signifying a further reality and goal of the sacrament, then you are able to resolve a problem that really bedeviled Reformation Eucharistic theology. The Lutherans and the Reformed their test question was, well, what happens? What is received by the person who doesn't believe?
Right.
And the Reformed tradition said, well, nothing. if you don't believe, then nothing. That, well, the Lutherans say to the Reformed, well, then there's nothing there except what you put there by your own head. And
Right.
that's not good enough.
Right.
Well, then, but the Lutherans say, even if you don't believe, you get, the whole shebang, basically. And then the Reformed say, well, then it's no longer of sacrament of faith, then it's a magic trick. And, so, I mean, I'm oversimplifying, but that's the rough outline. And what I suggest at the end of the book is, if you had an articulation like Thomas, you'd be able to say, on the one hand, the non-believer gets something genuinely real. And on the other hand, they don't the fact that they don't apprehend what they're doing means there is something genuinely lacking as well. Sure. And I suggest that if there was this more careful articulation of the relationship between sign and signified, Lutherans and Reformed Christians at the time of the Reformation might have been able to find some resolution between each other. So I didn't plan on this. This happened almost by accident as I was getting to the end of the book. I end up making this really bold claim that if the Reformers had Thomas to hand and understood him well, they could have actually better understood one another and come to a more satisfactory resolution between the main competing factions in Protestantism, which is, when I wrote my proposal, I was not imagining I was going to come to that end. But when you watch what happens in the Reformation debates, you just see these ships passing in the night, and the tracks they write against each other get longer and longer. I mean, there's Jesusius, and who's the other Lutheran? There's a couple people who are writing back and forth with Calvin, to the point, I think, where they end up distorting Calvin. If you read Calvin just when he's writing against these guys, it throws his theology off balance. So there's different versions of Calvin's Institutes, because he kept updating it over the years. And I would suggest that on this topic anyways, Calvin's Institutes before he started fighting with these Lutherans is better theologically and more balanced than after he starts fighting the Lutherans, because after he starts fighting the Lutherans, he gets sort of reactionary against them. And that's part of what has got Calvin read as a mere symbolist for centuries.
Sure.
Whereas if you go and read Calvin, he's not a mere symbolist. He's not a Zwinglian. He makes very strong statements against Zwingli at some points, but it's his pushback against, this sort of mutually extrematizing, that's not the right word, polarizing, they push each other into more extremes that gets Calvin read, I think, in a way that doesn't do justice to his own position. And so I say, look, if you all read Thomas, you'd all be
you'd all hold the
you would have understood each other better, and you would have had a solution to hand for your problem.
Sure. Would you say, so I watched your debate the other night with Dr. Stephen Nemish, and well done. Very, very interesting conversation. But you had said something really interesting in there. You said that that we should be something to the effect that we should be avoiding liturgical Pelagianism, and the idea of who's working in this. Are we, or is it God? And I almost want to say that in reading your book, it seems that the dilemma between the Reformed and the Lutherans ultimately kind of came on that question. The Lutherans wanted to emphasize that God is the one acting in this. It's not up to our human intellect or our faith or our will. And the Reformers were emphasizing, well, there's a need for faith. And it seems as though Aquinas is kind of right in the middle somewhere, saying God is actually doing something objectively that is independent of us. But at the same time, it's not as though faith is useless in actually receiving the benefits of the grace that's provided in the sacrament. Is that kind of...
You're exactly right. And one of the things that my book doesn't do is I don't engage with Zwingli. So on Pints with Aquinas the other night, and you can find this on YouTube, I engaged with a Zwinglian. And it was a different kind of conversation, because a lot of it went to patristics and stuff, which is not what my book is largely about. But you're right. And I think I got the term, I should give credit here. I don't think I gave credit the other night. I think I got that from George Hunsinger, who wrote a book called The Eucharist and Ecumenism. And the basic argument is, look, it's weird for Protestants to make the Eucharist merely a symbol, because if it's only a symbol, then the action happening in it is reducible to the human.
Right.
And so then liturgy is what we do, not what God does. And then we're Pelagians.
Right.
Right. It's Protestants of all people should say, no, this is a work of God. Right. And so I think that's the biggest problem with Zwinglian sort of merely symbolic approach, is that all of a sudden this thing which is promised to us, which is, we're commanded to do from a Catholic point of view, and I would say even from a broadly Protestant point of view, most Protestant traditions would say liturgy is the work of God. It is Christ's perfect worship of the Father in the Spirit, and we participate, but we're not the prime actors. And real presence functions in that in the same way, right? Real presence is a way of saying, this is a gift. You don't make this yourself. You don't make this Eucharist. You don't make this church. You don't worship perfectly. That's the whole story of the Old Testament, is just failure to worship one after another. We're going to get it wrong. Relying on our own power, we will worship inadequately, at least inadequately, and maybe, sacrilegiously or idolatrously, right?
Right. And the scrupulosity that could come out of just constantly analyzing, am I doing enough? Am I in the right mindset for this particular, it can be exhausting.
And I have the freedom, I go to church with 7 kids and I miss a lot,
Yeah.
And if it was about what I'm able to do, good luck. Even on my best days, when I'm not, sorting through all my own sinful whatever that's gumming up the works, right?
Right.
Just distraction is already too much of a, could you not wait with me 1 hour? No, Lord, I could not. But if it's God's work and I'm able to try to lift heart and mind to join myself in it to whatever degree is subjectively available to me in the moment, and then leave the rest to God, that's Protestant, right? That's Luther.
Right,
Just throw yourself on the mercy of God and let him deal with it, right?
Right. Yeah.
But it's part of Catholic liturgical piety. It's funny because it's in the Reformers when it comes to grace and works. But then when you transfer over to liturgy, it feels like it gets inverted,
Right. Yeah. Oh, that's absolutely right. Yeah. So maybe briefly, I don't want to take up too much of your time, but maybe briefly, if we could just talk about Calvin and the similarities that are found between him and Aquinas. We've kind of touched on the receptionism, which would be a major difference, and I think is largely influenced by his soteriological presuppositions. That if we're going to make the sacrament efficacious, it's got to be always efficacious for the elect, because God's grace does not pass to the reprobate. So therefore, they are just receiving the sign. So I think that a lot of those presuppositions led to his conclusions there. But maybe
I think that's right. Yeah.
Maybe just in terms of presence, the presence that he was advocating for, that some people think, and you had said this in the debate too, but some people reduce spiritual to this not real type idea,
right?
The spiritual presence. Oh, well, that's not real, but it's nothing's more real than the spiritual,
Right.
So can you kind of expound on that?
Yeah, I mean, Calvin very clearly intends to say that Christ is really present. I mean, there's no question that that's what he wants to say. The question is, do his tools allow him to say clearly that Christ is present? Now, the Lutherans didn't think so, because the Lutherans thought, the way he articulates it, if the non-believer gets nothing,
right,
then there's nothing there. Now, Calvin's not going to accept that argument, but that's what it looks like to his critical interlocutors, right? So the struggle with Calvin is to find the categories to say that this is really real without leading to consequences he doesn't want. And it's not clear to me he's totally successful in doing that. I think there's room to criticize Calvin, but I also don't think it's fair. One way to read it is to say look, in the end, he says, the non-believer gets nothing. Therefore, there was nothing there all along. He's just trying to pull the wool over our eyes. Well, if you want to, if your hermeneutic is to trap people, you can do that to Calvin. You can do it to Luther. You can do it to anybody. But I think if you try to read someone according to their own best intention, Calvin wants to say something real is happening here. And he will say, it's spiritual, and don't you give me this nonsense that spiritual is nothing. And I mean, I got to agree with them. Like when Catholics say, oh, it's not just a spiritual presence. What do you mean just a spiritual presence? Are you baptized? Like, can you find that in a lab? Like, does God exist? Can you find that in a lab? What do you mean spiritual is nothing? So I think we can, with appropriate qualifications, because people are going to misunderstand us, we can absolutely say that real presence is spiritual presence. Of course it is. In fact, if you had the opposite, would that be better? If you had like just a chunk of meat, is that what you want? What good is that? This is why, John 6, right? The Spirit gives life. Catholics don't need to hide from that.
Right.
That's great. Of course, that's what we want, right? Anyways, but no. So I think Calvin struggles to be able to say as strongly as he wants to that something real is going on. He says it at its most strongly when he's arguing with the Zwinglians.
Yeah.
When he rejects their bare memorialism as inadequate, then he sounds like an advocate of real presence. But when he's pushing back against Lutherans who he thinks have gone way too far, by making the presence as sort of almost like physical or a sort of blunt magic trick where just everyone gets the same thing whether they believe it or not. Now the role of faith is hard to figure out. Then he looks like a mere symbolist because of what he's pushing back against. But I think he does. But his basic structure looks a lot like Thomas. His basic sign and signified structure looks a lot like Thomas. And why? Because they both get it from Augustine. Right. They have a common theological heritage. So, people who want to imagine that Calvin just rejects everything in the medieval church and so he'll always be the opposite of Thomas. It's not only on Eucharist, by the way. There's other books on Calvin and Thomas that show that they're closer than people would guess on things like grace or even what is it? A friend of mine wrote a book on merit, where he looks at Thomas and Calvin and says like it's not so far apart as you'd guess.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of structure there, but I would venture that most of the time when that structure overlaps between Thomas and Calvin, go looking at Augustine, because they both rely so heavily on Augustine. Of course, they're going to look similar at various points, right?
Right. Awesome. Well, maybe just like a more personal question. I'm just out of my curiosity, in a topic like this, with a book like this that seems very much geared to pushing towards unity, what do you believe takes place in a Protestant Eucharist?
Oh, this is
probably a very challenging question, but
it's the right question, and I don't have a great answer, but I'll say, Catholics give bad answers to this. Catholics will say will imagine that the right Catholic answer is to say nothing happens, right? So we have transubstantiation, you don't. So if you think it's just a symbol, well, you're right. For you, that's all it is.
Sure.
Right. And now this, if I had time to go back and write another doctorate, I would write it on the question of holy orders, because this is the key difference is Catholics say that there's something lacking in a Protestant Eucharist because the Protestant Eucharist isn't celebrated in the communion of the church. And how do you know that? Because the orders of the presiding person are not in apostolic succession, right? That's how we can tell what's in the Catholic Church and what isn't. Right. If you go to a parish and the priest is ordained by a bishop who's in apostolic succession, well, then there's the Catholic Church. Now, if we want to say what happens in a Protestant Eucharist, then the bigger question in the background is, what do we think of Protestant orders?
Sure, yeah.
And we used to say, well, they're nothing. They're just laymen in fancy clothes, or lay women, as the case may be. And that doesn't seem adequate to the data. It doesn't seem and I got in trouble for this on saying something like this on Gospel Simplicities, but I didn't see a good counter argument. I need someone to make sense of this data for me. Look, in the Catholic Church, when the Archbishop of Canterbury comes to Rome, we don't treat him like a layman. We treat him as a bishop. I mean, Pope Paul VI and the Archbishop of Canterbury exchanged bishops' rings. You don't do that with a layman. Right. Or are we saying that Paul VI was like doing some dramatic, some theatrical thing that was a total fudge? I don't think we can say that's what's going on. But here's another really practical one. Catholic Church, if an Anglican priest or a Presbyterian or a Lutheran or any number of others becomes a Catholic, we'll ordain him even if he's married. Now, why on earth would we do that? Someone will tell you, oh, it's because he has certain practical experience and whatever, and so we make an exception in the case of a person with practical experience. Well, that might be part of the answer, but then you could do the same thing for a Catholic male who had the relevant experience. Sure. But I'm never going to get ordained, even though I'm married, given all the qualifications in the world. I can be more qualified than the Anglican who's converted. They won't ordain me while I'm married. Full stop. So we don't act like Protestant orders are literally nothing. But we don't actually have a good category for thinking about what they are. And that translates into us not having good categories for thinking about what happens at a Protestant Eucharist. Now, I'm going to suggest, and this is speculative, this is not the teaching of the church. This is a theologian saying, I'm trying to make sense of the data, right? Given what I just said, I want to look at Vatican II, where we start talking about the relationship between Protestant Christians and Protestant communities in the Catholic Church as one of real but imperfect communion. I think that's the best way forward on this question, is to recognize something that is real but imperfect. There's something in Protestant orders that is real, otherwise we wouldn't ordain you a Catholic priest even if you're married, but imperfect, because if it was perfect, we wouldn't need to ordain you at all. You'd already be ordained, right? We're ordering your orders. So I think the category of real but imperfect makes sense of Protestant orders. And if it does, then I think that's the category for thinking about what happens at a Protestant Eucharist as well. Sure. And if I'm going to get pushed back, I'm going to grab a book here and show it to you. Sure. Where did I put it? Here it is. Joseph Ratzinger's Pilgrim Fellowship of Faith. There's an exchange of letters in here with the bishop, Lutheran bishop, I believe his name is Hanselman. And the Lutheran bishop asks him, like, really, do you think nothing happens at a Lutheran Lord's Supper? And Ratzinger says, no, the question of validity of orders is not the only thing going on. He doesn't say it's an irrelevant question. He says there's more to the question. And it's very tantalizing. It doesn't go into a lot of detail. But if I was to write another doctoral thesis, that would be my jumping off point, is what is Ratzinger talking about in his letter to Hanselman, where he says, this can't be the whole story when we think about Protestant Eucharist, right? So I think the short answer from a Catholic point of view is we're somewhat agnostic about what happens in a Protestant Eucharist. We actually don't know. We know that God will not, like, where two or three are gathered, right? If a group of faithful Christians gets together and invokes the Lord, God's not going to be like, too bad, suckers. Like, right. Sure. That's not how it works. How that relates to what's going on in the elements and all that kind of stuff, I don't think we have categories for describing that. And I think we really need to think about it. But what I've put forward speculatively is, I think, a helpful jumping off point. And if there's a Catholic or Protestant theologian out there who's done work on this, I would love to be made aware of it. But it seems to me it's a big question in ecumenical dialogue. It's probably the biggest hurdle I can think of, actually, is this question of orders. And I think real but imperfect is the set of categories we need to make any headway on it.
Yeah. Wow. I would think that's probably the most balanced answer I've ever heard to that question. So.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. If you ever go on,
I might get some flack for it, but anyway.
Yeah. Well, if you ever go on to write on that subject, let me know. I would love to read more.
Okay.
So I guess this leads right into my closing question. It's a two-part question, but first part is, how central is the Eucharist to the future of Christian unity?
I mean, okay, my first answer is to almost say, well, it's the whole game.
Yeah.
I mean, that can be misunderstood, of course, but I mean, what's end game, right? I mean, to be able to regularly, not just regularly, what's the right word? I mean, we can share Eucharist now in exceptional circumstances. For sharing of Eucharist to stop being exceptional and to become the norm, that's the end game. That's the end game of ecumenism, right? Is that we regularly, and without like, oh, why is this special? Why are we allowed to do that here? No, this is what we do because we're Christians who are in communion with one another. That's it.
Right.
So in that sense, it's the whole game. But of course, I mean, that implies 25 other things, straightforward agreement that transubstantiation is a reasonable thing for a Christian to believe is not the whole game, obviously. Right. And so, questions like holy orders and other things. And you know what, it varies. And I should have said this actually about Protestant Eucharists too. It varies from one community to the next. When we say Protestants are in real but imperfect communion with the Catholic Church, we don't mean every Protestant is in the same relationship with the Catholic Church. There's a whole spectrum out there. Anglicanism in a lot of ways has a lot more in common with Catholicism than non-denominational. Some pastor started his own congregation on the outskirts of the city. Now we still think they're Christians, and unless there's some really good reason not to, we think their baptisms are valid. So that's the key. If you're validly baptized, you're in some communion with the Catholic Church, however imperfect. But within this whole range of things, I mean, the things that need sorting out between this community and that community can be quite varied. So it's hard to say, what the whole thing is. But Eucharist is what Christians do that make the church the church. From a Catholic perspective, many Protestants would agree with that, but other would add other things. That sacraments rightly sacramented and the word properly preached. Of course, I don't want to downplay the role of Scripture, but from a sociological, almost human reality, this is where we gather. This is where we say who we are. This is where we become who we are. So if agreement on the meaning of that is as important as anything else, that we need to agree on. And there's lots of other things that are important, but I don't think there's anything that's more important. So on the level of, what Christian unity looks like, it's the top. But on the level of what are the issues that we need to resolve between one another, well, that's going to vary from place to place and time to time and community to community. But I don't think there's any that's more important than this one, even if there's others that are maybe as important or as important, but maybe more urgent now, because maybe with my book and other work that others have done, this one isn't as far away as the question about orders or something like that. So it depends what your measuring stick is, but really, really important. There's my short answer.
I like it. Yeah. And a follow-up question, I'll kind of answer first because I want to hear more of the Catholic perspective, but what are some things that both Catholics and Protestants can do towards pursuing this unity? Because I think on my end, looking at Protestantism largely, I think the biggest thing that we can start doing is not finding our identity in opposing Rome. Because I think that Protestantism and a lot of them still have their identity very much rooted in, we are not Catholic. We are not Catholic, and that is what defines us. And I think so long as that is the defining part of Protestantism, to quote Peter Leithart, he says, Jesus bids Protestantism come and die. If that is where we're finding our identity. And I would fully agree. And so I think that we just need to recognize that if we claim semper reformanda, always be reforming, then that can mean the opposite direction again. That can mean seeing, okay, where are we now and where do we need to be to come to this deeper unity and ultimately in communion with the Roman Catholic Church. I mean, that's my heart. I think that should be the heart of every Christian, is to be in communion with one another. So having Protestants be open to that and to be pursuing that intentionally, I think is really, really important. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, well, I would agree. And I would say from the Catholic point of view, or from the Catholic side of things, the situation isn't that different. I mean, it's a little different because our root identity isn't not being Protestant, but we can get sucked into that.
Sure.
There, I mean, the false versions of transubstantiation out there are not unrelated to a kind of hardened anti-Protestantism, right? If they say it's a symbol, we're going to say it's really, really real,
Right.
and end up, polarizing. I would say this happens on all the major neuralgic questions: purgatory, the Pope, Mary, whatever, take your pick. It's very tempting for a Catholic to make their position one of strong anti-Protestantism, right? And so, I mean, we're in this interesting situation now where people who were very papalist until quite recently are now recognizing real limits on what papal authority means. Well, that would have been helpful 20 years ago.
Sure.
In talking to Protestants, that we recognize all kinds of limits on papal authority. Now there's people who recognize such limits because it's convenient for them. But without prejudging any of the particular questions they may have issues about, that's not the point. The point is, we've sometimes sort of over-interpreted things or overstated things about Mary or the Pope or purgatory or the Eucharist or whatever, precisely in response to Protestant challenges. And so I think that the thing for all Christians is to find a space where we're curious. We want to know what the other group genuinely thinks and believes, and we're literally better able to understand our differences if we properly understand how we agree. Otherwise, our differences get thrown out of proportion and become identity markers, instead of places where we seek truth. But if I know a Christian of goodwill who believes something different than I do, I want to be curious about that. I want to say, why do you think that, and how does that actually relate to what I think? Instead of looking to defeat right off the hop. You mentioned the thing with Stephen Nemish the other night on Pints with Aquinas. Well, clearly I disagree with Stephen Nemish, and it came out that I disagreed with him, but my goal was not to defeat him. My goal was to understand and be understood. Right. And then, maybe we learn from each other. I think he has more to learn from me than I have from him, but of course he thinks the opposite.
Right.
Otherwise, we'd be on opposite sides of the debate from the start, right? I mean,
yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and that's all I got for questions. But thank you so much for coming on. This has been an absolute joy to talk. I guess just in wrapping up, is there anything that you want to let people know where they can find you? I'll have links to all of it below, I'm sure. So,
sure.
But yeah, final thoughts.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me. It was great to be here. You read the book carefully, and you asked questions that helped me articulate things. I feel like I said things the way I wanted to say them by and large. So buy the book. It gets into some more detail than I could even remember to go into here. But you can find me in various places on the internet. My podcast, as we mentioned at the beginning, is got like 300 back episodes or something. So you'll get tired of my voice before too long. Just search me on YouTube. I've done interviews with lots of people. Gospel Simplicity, you mentioned, Pints with Aquinas. I've done quite a few interviews with a Christian Reformed pastor named Paul Vanderklay, who's got a neat channel, and a handful of other things. My major outlet right now for my writing has been Church Life Journal. So if you just search Salkeld and Church Life Journal, you'll find, a bunch of pieces there. but I'm published in various places. Word on Fire, Crux. I've been on Busted Halo, which is a Catholic radio show. But if you follow me on Twitter at Brett Salkeld, then whenever I have something new, whether it's written or a video or audio interview, I'll just share it on there. So if you follow me there, you'll stay up to date with those kinds of things. Yeah, and check out go to my Amazon page and you'll see all the books I've written, but then go buy the books from the publishers instead of buying them from Amazon.
There you go. Sounds good.
Or from your local bookstore.
Even better. Yes. So, well, Dr. Brett Salkeld, thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Lovely to be here.
Thank you so much for tuning in to this podcast today. I really appreciate it. If you wouldn't mind, please click the subscribe button, like the video, share the video. It helps bring more people to my channel and helps this ministry grow. Also, if you're watching and you want to find a way to support this ministry, you can click the link to my Patreon right in the description of this video. And there you'll find different tier levels where I give you exclusive content in exchange for your support. It means a lot to me, and I really appreciate you watching.